Hello everyone and welcome back to COM 350. Today we are talking about Stephen Toulmin. This will be a relatively short video because I know that a lot of you have studied Stephen Toulmin in other classes. A lot of you are very familiar with his argumentation model, and also I believe the book actually has the model in there. So I'm going to give you a little bit background on Stephen Toulmin and why his model is in fact still useful, even though it may seem like it's not, and also tell you some of the ways in which we use that model now. So let's just tell you this. Stephen Toulmin died on December 9th of 2009. I remember that very, very well because I was teaching at Missouri State. I was teaching a graduate class in rhetorical theory at the time, and I was teaching Stephen Toulmin that night, the day that he died. So it really hit me kind of hard a little bit because Stephen Toulmin's probably one of my favorite theorists that I work with and that we study in this class. I always wanted to go take a class from him. He was teaching, I believe, at USC at the time that he died. And I just really wish I had gotten a chance to meet him. And I think I said that for about 15 years before he ultimately passed on. And I, regret to this day that I didn't run out there and see what I could do to meet him. Anyway, he was apparently a nice guy. He had a lot of marriages to, I believe it was 3 different women or 4 different women from 4 different countries, and had 1 child with each of them or something like that. He was from a lot of places, really. He was born in England, but he lived in Germany, and he spent most of his later life in the United States, and there's good reason for that. The first thing we should know about Stephen Toulmin is that he was a mathematician and logician. He actually worked in an aeronautic company for a while in Germany during the war, or right after the war. I'm not really sure when it was, but I believe it was during the war. And then he returned to England. And during that time, he was influenced by a couple of other theorists that were European continentalists, but he didn't really seem to fit in. Most of his work was theoretical math and determining logic from math. He wasn't really a big fan of trying to get into the more philosophical side of what the people at that time were doing, what the philosophers at that time were doing. And so as a mathematician, his peer group rejected him. As a logician, they rejected him. And it wasn't really until the United States said, hey, our Western philosophy and our Western democracy needs you, because what Stephen Toulmin was attempting to do was to find a way to look at a model or a map or a formula, if you will, of how public discourse handles moral debate. So that's what he was interested in. And, a lot of people try to find the formula, the overarching theory of communication and persuasion, right? And I'm not really sure that it exists, but at least we haven't found it yet, I'll say that much. So Stephen Toulmin was trying to find a formula to understand how public argument worked. He did come up with a model, a theory of understanding public discourse in terms of values and morality. I don't know that he answered his own question in the end, but what we get from it is that he was pretty much missing the one part of the leap between logic and reason and public discourse, and that leap is the probable outcome, the likely outcome, not the single only outcome. In other words, what he was missing was the art of rhetoric. So when he didn't realize that, and he would actually write about how to make these arguments, and I don't think he ever realized what he was writing about was uniquely at the time American democracy, Western democracy mostly. And so instead of staying over there on the continent that did not want him, he came on over to the United States. I'm not going to tell you that by the time he died that he would have been accepted over there either. Excuse me. Yes, there were democracies. I'm making myself yawn. I'm not sure how. Yes, there were democracies, but there were not as many that were as focused on the power and voice of the people as ours. So his philosophy really worked over here in the United States. Philosophy departments particularly would invite him to come and be a lecturer at the universities here in the United States. I don't know where all he went, but I can tell you that in the end, I believe he was at USC. So that's a little bit of his personal background and what it was that he was trying to do. So what is it that we rhetoricians or scholars of rhetoric supposed to take from Toulmin? There are many things we can take from him, but today with you, I'm going to focus on just one, and that is his model for argument. So he has a 6-part model that basically, remember, he was a modernist. He was looking for something to plug things into so that we could get understanding out on the other side. This was very difficult to do. This 6-part model is made up of 3 main parts and then what we call 3 subparts, if you will. Doesn't mean they're not any more important, it just means those 3 subparts can only exist if the 3 main parts do. So what are the 3 main parts? Very simply, data, claim, and warrant. Okay, so what is the data? The data is the evidence. That is to say, what has been established as true. Now, you might recall that Aristotle talked about inartificial proofs, and that would be part of this. The claim is obviously the argument that you're putting forward, the final conclusion, the thing you want people to agree with you on, the thing you're trying to persuade people about. And in between there, in between the data and the claim is the warrant. Now, the warrant has been abused in multiple ways, like been, sort of summarily dismissed at times. Other people who say, well, it's the word therefore, that gets us from the data to the claim. That is not true. The warrant explains how the data supports the claim. So it's not one word. It is a demonstration of how the data, the evidence, actually supports the claim you're making. Now, in a complex public discourse, this can be actually pretty difficult to do. So I don't want to pretend like it's super easy, especially because we have those subparts that become important once you have identified the data, the claim, and the warrant. So those 3 subparts are related to the main parts. The first subpart is the qualifier or the modifier. This is a part that changes or modifies in some way your claim. The second one is the rebuttal. The rebuttal is anything you can think of, an argument you can think of that might be against your claim, and can you work that into your qualified claim? If you can, then you should do that. And then finally, what we call backing. And backing is further evidence for the warrant. So sometimes you have a bunch of data, but you need one more piece of evidence to get to the claim. That is called backing, and it's for the warrant. So this gives you an idea of how these work together. The data may be disputed, so there may be a rebuttal. The claim may not be as strong or may be stronger than you thought, so you might have to modify it. And finally, the warrant might not be strong enough, so you need backing. So you can see how these all work together. Now, those 6 parts, you can't just say, oh, I did them, therefore I have a good argument. I have seen plenty of public discourse where the argument was great, but the outcome of that argument was a failure. For example, O.J. Simpson's been in the news since his death, so I'll go there. If you watched his trial, but you were not in the jury pool, then you saw a lot more than the jury did. And that can change the argument. So for me, I don't even think I was in my 20s. I might have been getting to my 20s when that whole thing came down. He was, in our minds, I say ours because I mean the public, those of us who talked about this, in our minds he was guilty. There was just no question. There was evidence out there that we were privy to that the jury was not. And I know it's like, how the heck did they miss a TV news program that millions of people watched? The great Bronco chase. When that happened on the highway in California, when he was fleeing his house. Like, how do these things not come in for jury consideration? And the fact of the matter is that there are times when arguments may seem like they are data for a claim. He ran away in his white Bronco, therefore he's guilty, because fleeing is a sign of guilt. So I put my warrant at the end there. Hopefully you could see that. However, someone might argue that his fleeing is definitely not an indicator one way or another of guilt, and therefore is irrelevant to a court proceeding. Now, I don't know that actually happened in that specific instance, but I believe that did. So it's a good example, at least, of how data can be put into or taken out of an argument to come to a conclusion. Now, when I said earlier that Stephen Toulmin's biggest problem was that he did not want to find what was most likely the case, he did not want to find the most probable claims. He wanted to find claims that were true, like the truth, that there was one singular truth. It was only later in his life that he realized that he couldn't do that, and really what he was doing was making an argument about why rhetoric is important, because it's not just the 6 parts of the argument and whether or not you put that model in the right order. It's how the argument got presented with all of the parts in consideration. Now, do we all talk in those 6 parts all the time? No. I mean, for example, I don't go up to people and say, hey, you know what? It's almost noon. I ate breakfast at 7. My stomach is making these noises. I think it's empty. Therefore, I might need to eat. Do you want to go get lunch? Right? We don't go through all of those steps because we assume those premises to be true. I'm going to say, hey, Joe, did you eat yet? No? Okay, let's go eat, and that's going to be the end of it. So, but in public discourse, when claims are being made that impact the morality, the values of the public, how do we come to those conclusions? So you take these 6 parts of an argument and you have them all, but you don't present them in a way that lets the audience know what the most probable outcome is, then your argument is not going to go anywhere. You're not going to win. They're not going to believe your claim. You're not going to be persuasive. So really, he's most useful in hindsight. Okay, it looks like this argument failed because of this. But the truth is, like I said with the OJ case, I have heard plenty of arguments that seemed, well, I'm going to have to say seemed because I wasn't there, but seemed very airtight. And I don't know how you question them, but the decision came out the other way. This has happened recently more than ever. Well, I won't say totally recently. Casey Anthony was another case where we heard about it from the media and we were just all like, there's no way she's not guilty. There's no way. And she was found not guilty. And this is where it becomes important to understand that there's a distinction between not guilty and innocent. In a court of law, I don't have to prove anybody innocent. I just have to prove that they're not guilty. for some reason they're not guilty. When we are proving guilt, we have sort of this one all-encompassing, you are guilty. However, we have qualifiers, right? You're guilty, but it's diminished because it was an accident or because it was manslaughter, not murder. Take your pick, right? There's also, there are a few cases out there right now where we may all have very strong opinions about what we think is most likely true. So, do I believe that Casey Anthony is most likely guilty? Yes, I do. Was she found guilty in a court of law? No, she was not. Does that mean that the arguments failed? Well, they certainly disagree with the public discourse, right? But amongst those 12 people who made that decision, it was pretty clear to them, right? So the argument is persuasive depending on the context, which will dictate what kind of data you can have, which will talk about the end result of the claim based on how that data is put together. So, you know, when some people say that's a circumstantial case, I was listening to a podcast the other night and they were like, all cases are circumstantial. And that's not the first time I've heard that. My father used to say that all the time too. He was a lawyer. So he used to say, well, circumstantial is the only way that there's a court case. And I think what really might help us out in understanding Toulmin's argument model is that circumstantial really means that the warrant is the most important thing. The data, very important, but not the end result. The end result, very important, but not a leap from the data. But the warrant is what describes the circumstances of how the data supports the claim. I'm hoping those examples give you some clarity on what a warrant is. When I was in college, a lot of times people just had data and claims. We would always talk about how we were missing the warrant. Nowadays, I can say with honesty in the public discourse that it's mostly just claims. There's no data, there's no warrant, there's no nothing. It's just, this is how I feel. And whenever somebody says, this is my claim, and I say, well, what's the reasoning behind that? Or how did you come to that conclusion? I mean, I never say, where's the warrant? Because that's stupid. That's not going to help them out any, right, in common everyday conversation. And they say, it's my opinion, that's all that matters. That's not an argument. Like, that doesn't help. Why is it so hard to give reasons behind any claim that we make, right? It shouldn't be that hard. And more importantly, when it comes to policy decision making, especially in the public discourse, there is no opinion, right? Let's talk about that. What types of claims are there that people make? Because I've been talking a lot about courtrooms, or like a claim of innocence and guilt, or a claim of guilt of good and bad. So what are these types of claims, and which ones do we use the most? So there's a claim of fact. Now, it's important that you understand that a claim of fact does not mean it is true. A claim of fact can be proven true or untrue. For example, the Holocaust happened. That is a claim that can be proven true and proven untrue. Now, it just so happens that I happen to fall on the it's definitely true side, and most people do, but there are those out there who say, no, it never happened, right? And they have their reasons for that. The moon landing, we landed on the moon. That could be proven true and it could be proven false, right? There are ways for us to find those answers. So when somebody says it's a fact that blah, 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 I'm always like, is that a true fact or a false fact? So a claim of fact can be proven true or untrue. Second is the claim of value. A claim of value is placing like a quality on something. Good, bad, ugly, pretty, just, unjust, and so on, right? So you're putting a value on something. If I were to say to you, oh, you know what, Kansas City is a better city than St. Louis, is that a question of fact? No, that's a question of value. Which one is better, right? Not is one true and not true. It's, is one of those better. So it's a quality, right? And finally is a claim of policy, which this is not hard because it's always the same. It's found with the words should or should not, almost exclusively. Should we take this action? Should we not take this action? Right now, public policy that's in public debate, such as the abortion debate, is all about public policy. It's all about should we, shouldn't we. And within that, people are going to have claims of value and claims of fact, right? And if you really want to get into the weeds with public discourse, there's not just one argument. You have to put together all of the arguments in order to understand it. So if you could imagine how many Toulmin models you would need in order to understand the intricacies of sort of the bigger questions in public discourse, that could get quite unruly. So I don't know that Toulmin ever came to the best conclusion about whether or not we can answer the question of how we come to a conclusion in a public discourse. But there are some things that he gave us. Number one, yes, we have a model now. We have a theory of how argument works. Number two, we can use that model to evaluate why or how an argument succeeds or fails. Three, while it works mostly in hindsight, we can learn from what was missing in the argument for it to not be persuasive. So I hope that helps you understand the model that the book presents to you from Stephen Toulmin and how he tried to, I always say, math us into an understanding of the, quote, one and only truth. But even he, in the end, realized that we were still talking about probability, and we could only come to a conclusion about what will probably work and what will most likely happen. In other words, he brings it all back to the practice and understanding of rhetoric. Okay, everybody, I hope that helps. Let me know if you need anything else on Stephen Toulmin, and I will see you back here on Thursday. Have a good week.